On my honor, Chapter 7. Joel leaned into his bike, pushing as hard as he could, almost running up the hill. His heart drummed in his ears. The boy and his girlfriend were still sitting in their car, probably arguing about the whether or not to go to the police. Their presence behind him in the road made the skin between Joel's shoulder blades and up the back of his neck feel tight and bunchy. When the car finally pulled away, rumbled across the bridge and up the opposite hill, Joel quit pushing and dropped across the handlebars, gasping for breath. After a few moments he looked back. The car was gone. Heat wavered off the empty road. He began to push his bike again, more slowly now. When he was 3/4 of the way to the top of the small road, the car crested the hill and started towards him. Joel straightened up, freezing his features into what he hoped was an image of innocence and nonchalance. Still, when the car passed, he had to turn away. If the people in the car got a good look at his face, they would know. His mother had always told him that he was the worst keeper of guilty secrets in the world. When he was a little kid, if he walked past her with a snitched cookie in his pocket, she would take one look at his face and say, "Joel, what do you have in your pocket?" Now everybody was going to look at him and say, "Joel, why did you go swimming in the river? Joel, what did you do to your best friend?" And what kind of question would the police ask? What would they guess without even asking? Joel stopped in his tracks, his heart beginning to hammer again. He couldn't go back. He just couldn't. He jerked his bike around, facing it down the hill and away from the town, away from the police, the Zabranskis, his parents. He climbed on, standing with all his weight on the pedals so that his rear wheel fishtailed as he moved out. This time, he would build up enough speed to make it to the top of the other side of the valley without having to get off once to push. His father had given him permission to ride his bike all the way to Starved Rock Park. He was going to ride to the park. A line of fire measured the top of Joel's thighs. He pedaled steadily, glancing neither to the right nor to the left, images flashing through his brain. The woods at the park were dense. He could hide his bike easily, and then himself. Maybe he could even find a cave in the bluffs that he could stay in. He could live on berries and roots the way that the Indians had done. They had hidden out on the top of Starved Rock Bluff to get away from an enemy tribe, but he couldn't do that. There were footpaths and fences at the top of the bluffs now. Tourists, too. Anyway, an enemy tribe had trapped the Indians up there, starved them to death, giving the park its name. A semi roared past, the suction of the huge wheels tugging at Joel and at his bicycle. All he would need to do would be to loosen his grip. The truck would take care of the rest. Joel stopped pedaling, steered onto the shoulder, and then he dropped heavily off the bike. What was he doing? Did he really think that he was going to hide out? And, if he found some place to hide in, how long could he stay? Until he grew up? Or died? But it wasn't his fault, was it? Just because he didn't follow his father's orders, that didn't make what happened to Tony his fault. His father was the one who had said it was all right to ride up to the park in the first place. Joel hadn't even wanted to go. And then there was Tony. Crazy Tony, insisting on swimming in the river when he couldn't even swim at that well. Joel expelled a long breath. He felt lighter somehow. He glanced both ways, then walked his bike across the road and started back in the direction that he had come from. He would go home. That was where he belonged, no matter what had happened. He began to pedal again, his bike in the highest gear so that the least movement on his part propelled him the farthest. Home. The narrow tires sang against the pavement. Home. There was one thing he needed, though. He needed to decide what to tell his parents and the Zabranskis when they asked about Tony. He could tell them. He could tell them that he and Tony had started to ride their bikes out to Starved Rock. He could tell them that Tony had stopped when they were crossing the bridge. It was so hot. The river was there, cool and wet. Tony wanted to go swimming. It was the truth, wasn't it? And then he could tell them how he tried to talk Tony out of going into the river. And he could explain that Tony wouldn't listen, because Tony never listened once he had made up his mind. But then Joel would remind his father of the promise that he had made that morning. He would say that he told Tony that he couldn't go down to the river with him. He would tell how he had ridden on to Starved Rock by himself. The day was hot, though, and it wasn't much fun riding so far without Tony. So he'd turn around and come back. The explanation assembled itself in Joel's mind, logical and complete. Why hadn't he thought of it before? What had made him run away? He loosened his clenched fists, one at a time, from the handle grips and kept pedaling towards home. But when he arrived at the top of the ridge overlooking the Vermilion River again, he stopped and he stared at the road, the bridge, the wall of trees nearly obscuring the water. If only there were some other way to get home. He didn't know another route into town, though. Besides, the fire in his thighs had moved into his calves. His shoulders were cramped, and any other route home would undoubtedly be longer than this one. Joel squeezed the handbrakes and began to creep down the steep hill towards the bridge, the brake pads squealing lightly against the wheels. Tony had stayed behind to go swimming. That was what Joel would tell everybody. But if he had really ridden out to Starved Rock when Tony had gone down to the water, he would have stopped to check on Tony on the way back, because he wouldn't know. Joel reached the bridge, still holding the bike in tight control, and pedaled slowly across, keeping his eyes carefully on the road. And the other side, though, he hesitated, stopped, wheeled his bike down to the embankment, and propped it against the understructure of the bridge. He would just check, so people wouldn't look at his face when he explained, and know that he hadn't even checked. Tony's BMX was still there, carefully obscured in the long grass. Joel walked slowly towards the riverbank, keeping his mind carefully blank. The whole thing could have happened the way that he had figured it out. It all made sense. A squirrel scolded in a nearby tree. The river made a burbling sound, almost as if it was laughing. There were Tony's clothes scattered haphazardly along the ground, exactly where they had been dropped, except for the shirt the girl had moved. One sock hung on a nearby bush, and the other lay in the midst of a patch of violets. Sighing over Tony's carelessness, Joel gathered up his clothes, folded them, put them in a neat pile. He folded the pale blue shirt last and laid it on top of the rest. Then he surveyed the result of his work. Something was wrong. Tony had never folded his clothes in his life, not unless his mom was standing over him anyway. Joel reached down and mused the shirt. As he straightened up, the gleaming surface of the water caught his gaze. The river was unchanged, innocent. For an instant, Joel couldn't breathe. His throat closed and the air was trapped in his chest in a painful lump. He lifted his hands in surprise, in supplication. But when the breath exploded from him again, he brought it with it a bleeding moan. Joel stood on the bank clutching at himself and swaying. Tony was dead. Dead.